Hello there, and a huge welcome to today's episode of Gina Gardiner and Friends. This episode is one of a series that I'm doing in the run up to the Fatima's UK campaign One Voice Summit, which is all about bringing about collaboration and change to the care system in the UK. And children in the care system, generally speaking, have poorer life chances and opportunities than their peers who live with their parents. And today I'm joined by Peter Grigg. Peter is the Chief Executive of Home Start UK, and we're going to be talking about compassionate communities. So, Peter, a huge welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Gina.
So, before we actually get started, let's talk about your background and how you come to be a chief executive of an organisation. And many people won't be familiar what Home Start is, but let's start with you and then we'll go on to Home Start.
Thank you. So I've worked in the family and children's sector and charities for quite a few years. I grew up in London. My dad's a Methodist minister and my mum's a head teacher. And I guess from both those experiences in central London, which can be quite it's always very diverse population, but there's just so much need really across London in different ways. From both those experiences, I was always very aware of the importance of community around people and the sort of othering that goes on about people having issues and challenges in life and sort of othering them and thinking those people over there. And I just never felt like that. I just think the communities are communities and they're made up of all sorts of people with all sorts of strengths and experiences. So I was just always fascinated in that. I studied social policy and politics at university, thinking that maybe politics was a way to have a go at making some of this more equal. And I rolled out of university into a job working for a political advisor who was called Philip Gould, and he was running focus groups and opinion polls for Tony Blair and Number 10 at that time, which seems many, many years ago. And it was a fascinating eye-opener to politics and how it works.
Mhm.
Some people get hugely motivated by that sort of cut and thrust of politics, but I got more interested in policy making and campaigning and how it was that some issues got to the forefront of political attention and some things just didn't. And that sort of interested me, and I went into a world into policy and campaigning, starting with further education, moving into youth entrepreneurship, which we might touch on a bit, particularly trying to close the gaps between people with more with less advantages in life and less sort of privilege, and how entrepreneurship isn't really a level playing field. What could you do to try and equalize some of that? So some interesting experiences there. From that world, I moved into more directly into family and children's and parenting charities. So, firstly, with the Family and Parenting Institute, which is now called Quorum Family and Childcare, looking at issues of what gets in the way of really brilliant parenting, and then to the Children's Society for a long period of time, culminating in being Director of External Affairs, leading policy work, campaigning work, and marketing comms for that great charity doing lots of work with children across the UK, but particularly those facing lots of challenges in life. And then from the Children's Society, became Chief Executive of Home Start UK in January 2020, about 5 years ago, where I've been ever since. And I'm sure I'll say a bit more about Home Start, but that's my journey in a quick way.
What difference do you think it's made that you started off looking at policy and now when you look working with Home Start, you're dealing with policies externally to you that have a huge impact on what you're doing?
Yeah, I think people who go down the sort of policy analysis, research, that sort of track of development in their career, I think probably inherently quite instinctively quite strategic, quite big picture thinkers, and thinking about systems and how things interact and what goes wrong. And so it feels quite a natural step from policy work to thinking strategically as a chief executive, but also, I guess, more systemically about the issues that we see. So many charities are doing brilliant work. There's no end of brilliant work. But it really does sometimes feel like we're all just, applying sticking plasters to issues and just making do. And so I think when anybody does that for a while, you take a step back and look at it, you can't help but think about, well, what is going wrong here? What are the root causes that seem to be getting in the way of progress? And how might we challenge this and tackle this more systemically? So I do think systems thinking and systems change comes quite naturally to the sort of policy line. And it, I think, is part of the answer, part of the question that we need to ask when we talk about the care system. What do we mean by system? We'll come back to what we mean by care, but I don't think that these things are you can really separate them too easily.
It's very complex, isn't it? But one of the things that I've been made even more aware of as I've done the work with the charity Fatima's UK campaign is that so much is said, the rhetoric around government and government policies, around investigations when something's gone badly wrong. There's no shortage of rhetoric, and this must never happen again. And yet, consistently, we see the same issues arising because, as you say, things are dealt with at very surface level, but nobody gets to the underneath and what's the root cause, which is not actually within the care system. It starts long before that, doesn't it? And doing intervention work and helping people so they don't get into the care system.
Absolutely. I think this is all, as you say, it's really complex territory, isn't it? That life and social change and society is just, it's not straightforward. There's all sorts of levers to pull, influences to bear, and public opinion and, the economy and everything else has its role to play. But it's tempting, particularly in short-term time frames of sometimes of political cycles, for example, to sort of overpromise and say you can sort these things out, and it was the other lot's problem, and we're here now, we'll sort it all out, don't you worry. But the truth is that abuse, neglect, poverty, these are complex, knotty issues that just need a lot of thought, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of patience to sort out. And that's not always possible in the sort of timeframes of political cycles.
I certainly think, particularly around collaboration, one of the things that we've noticed is organizations often work in silos. As you say, there's some brilliant work going on, but it seems to be in pockets rather than becoming the system, if you like. But we'll talk more about that later. Homestart. Tell me about Homestart. How did it originate? What does it do?
So Home Start's about 50 years old, and it started. There's a lady called Margaret Harrison who created Home Start. She had experienced a gap in her area where she lived in and around Leicester, of families who weren't really getting the support they needed. She thought that, they didn't really have friends and family around and sort of trusted adults to offer support, but at the same time didn't always have the problems of the severity that required intervention or social work support. And so she just saw this group of people, mostly mums at that time she was looking at, who were struggling with parenting in the early years of a child's life, and could just really be helped with a friendly arm around and a bit of advice, a bit of experience, but really more than anything else, a bit of compassion, which might be lacking. A lot of people are judgmental about parenting and what should be done, what shouldn't be done, and that can feel really overwhelming for new parents and particularly for parents who are isolated. So Margaret was fascinated in this, and she won something called a Churchill Fellowship, which was an opportunity to go to the States and look at models of support for families that were developing in the 1970s in the US. And there was a model of something called Head Start, which some people might be familiar with, but it had multiple parts to it. But the core parts of relevance to this bit of the story were something that looks a bit like children's centres based in low-income communities, offering wraparound provision to children and families. And associated with those children's centres was home visiting support.
Mhm.
And what that was in America was paid professionals going into the homes of families with challenges in their lives, spending a few hours a week to help help those families. Now, Margaret saw this. She thought the model could work in the UK. She thought we could do it better with volunteers because, who wants a paid person coming around knocking at the door? You're just going to be quite fearful from families who are maybe on the edges of care or on the edges of social work sort of awareness. Then actually, somebody knocking on the door from the council might not be the best thing. So she thought, well, let's do this with volunteers. And she adopted this model, which was looking for people who had been parents themselves. Typically, they were grandparents, and typically in the 1970s, they were grandmothers who would go in a few hours a week to help other families, younger parents, as I say, back then, typically mums. We've addressed all this now. We're more diverse. We're still on a journey of diversity, but we're for all parents. For all volunteers, might be men, women, they might be parents themselves, they might not be these days. So from that model, she started something called Home Start in Leicester in 1973, and the model grew and grew and grew, and it got to such an extent that in the early days, Margaret would go around and set them all up and train the volunteers and make sure they had a trustee board there that knew what they were doing. But when you got to about 10 or 15 or 20 home starts, it was getting a bit unmanageable. So if I fast forward really quickly, then she created Homestart UK, which was this bit in the middle of what became a federation. So each Homestart now is a separate entity. They're each a separate charity with their own board of trustees, their own need to sort of raise funds and everything else. And Homestart UK supports it all from the centre. So it grew very quickly in line with what happened with children's centres in the late 90s and early 2000s. And interestingly, just to bring you back to that Head Start story, the other bit of the Head Start story, the Children's Centres bit, under Bill Clinton, it really exploded and it was everywhere across the US. And that was the model that became sort of our sure start in this country because Tony Blair and his team had seen that and liked it. So the Home Start connection to Head Start, fast forward to the UK a few years later, and because all the Sure Start centres that were being set up had to have a home visiting element, then the Home Starts numbers ballooned. We had around 300 Home Starts around that time. Then austerity happened, we have fewer now. But so if I fast forward right to today, there's 180 home starts around the UK. We have around 10,000 volunteers. We help around 60,000 families every year. And we offer home visiting support and group work support to families who are facing challenges. And I'll explain a bit more about the model as we go, but that's the potted history of Home Start.
Thank you. And as a head teacher, and although I left teaching 20 years ago, um, we were very aware of these centres and opportunities because they did such amazing work. And later on, I went in and did some training for volunteers. Um, and the work that they did, I think, was very valuable. And sadly, I think different governments have come and gone and have not necessarily recognised the value of that intervention. And for me, I think when you look at how society has changed, if you go back not that long ago, but not necessarily in our lifetime, people tended to live in the same area for a long time. They had the church, they had the neighbours. There was that support for people just by the very nature of the environment in which they lived, which as people became more mobile and more fragmented, that support became less and less for many people. And I think that we can see some of the challenges that that creates when there's no infrastructure to help young parents, and particularly if they are single parents and they don't have a partner or they don't have a family structure nearby that can help out.
I
We're going to
think,
go for a
well, I
break.
think I think that's absolutely right, Gina. And I think that's why compassionate communities is really the answer, or a potential part of the answer to supporting children and families wherever we are. And if we can't build compassionate communities around children, then really, how can we ever expect any progress?
I absolutely agree with you. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, I want to explore with you what are the benefits to those individuals who are on the receiving end of the support, but also what are the benefits on for those people who are actually volunteering? Because I do think it's a two-way process, and people who are listening may want some support or feel they've got something to give and the time and want to make a difference. And I think we want to look at this as a two-sided coin. Don't go away. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back. So, Peter, benefits. Talk me through what the recognized benefits for people who are receiving that intervention.
So the Home Start model, I'll just say a bit about the model first to answer the question. We see our work as relational. It's non-judgmental. We come in to stand alongside families. We don't see our work as delivering an intervention. We're not there to deliver, a how-to guide of being a better parent. We're not there to tell people what to do. We're there to walk alongside people as they find their confidence as a parent. And in doing so, yes, we can tackle some of the challenges that get in the way of good parenting. We can role model what good child attachment looks like. We can role model what reading to children and the importance of that looks like. We can help break down some of the challenges such as financial struggles or energy bills going through the roof. So there's all sorts of practical stuff that we do. But really, above all, it's an emotional support that we're offering, particularly to the most isolated parents. So if that's our model, our volunteers spend a few hours a week in our home visiting work. We also provide other sorts of forms of support, such as group sessions. But through our home visiting work, a few hours a week with a parent, just to feel less lonely, to feel less overwhelmed, and to sort of know that there is somebody there interested in listening to the parent themselves in their own right and not judging them. So if I take all that and say, well, okay, well, what difference does it make? Probably the best way to explain it is via the people who actually receive the support. And time again, I'm told that Home Start's work is a lifeline. Time and time again, I hear that Home Start were the only people with any time to spare for them in the whole week. I spoke to a mum during the pandemic who told me that a phone call, obviously we were shielding at that time, at the early stages of the pandemic, the phone call from Home Start was the only social contact she was having in a week. She wasn't getting any other contact. And you can imagine how vulnerable people were generally, but particularly those with a history of sort of mental health challenges and loneliness and isolation. This phone call was a lifeline. And so if I, was to describe the benefits of Home Start's work, I would say that it is about tackling isolation. It's about building parental confidence. And in doing so, we know that that makes a difference on a child's development and a child's future outcomes. We see the difference. We see a child who is starting to show signs of not playing brilliantly, of not interacting brilliantly. Maybe the speech and language development isn't where one might expect sort of the general population to be. And after a few weeks and months of Home Start support, it can be transformational for a parent and for their child.
It's interesting, there's been much in the news over the last few months about the number of children coming into school who don't answer to their name, who are not potty trained, who don't have some of the basic skills of dressing themselves that one would expect them to have at that age. And I think, for many parents who do feel isolated, and they may feel isolated within the family, you don't have to be physically on your own to feel isolated, do you?
Okay.
And I think so many, particularly young parents, or new parents rather than young parents, their view of parenthood is based on the films that they've watched and so on. And then this little bundle arrives and they've not had any sleep and the child won't feed and or it's a little bit older and it only wants to eat yellow food. And it won't sleep in a bedroom on its own. And it can really escalate to a point where parents feel that they're failing, that they're no use. And as they lose their confidence, so things just deteriorate from there, don't they?
They really do. And I think there's so many pressures on parents to be the perfect parent. There's so much information out there about, feeding, about the child development, about how much you should be doing of this, that, and the other, and how you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing that. Some of the advice is brilliant, and some of it is quite contradictory, and there's too much of all of it. And in the sort of cut and thrust of having a new baby and all the other challenges that might throw up, it can be hard to take any of that in. And so I think we judge parents far too much. I think we all have a view on what good parenting looks like. We'll have a background of different versions of parenting, and we bring that to it. As a new parent, it can be really there can be a lot of stigma around raising your hand up and saying, "Do you know what? I'm struggling here."
Yeah.
Or, I know that all the images of how joyful one should be when a child comes, I'm not feeling that joyful. What's going on? Am I failing my child? And I think where Homestart comes in is trying to just understand some of that, but perhaps put it to one side and work on the strengths that are inherent in everybody. I do like to believe that the vast majority, this is unfortunately not every parent, but the vast majority of parents are wanting to do the best for their child. And I think that that's where we excel. We find those strengths, we build the confidence in those strengths, and we get them happening more often. And it's things like that, small steps that you can take that can lead to really powerful transformation. And so, this strengths-based approach, I think, is where we come from. It's not telling people how to parent, but perhaps if you mentioned somebody only eating yellow food. Yeah, why is that? What's the pattern going on here? Have we observed it? What do we think about that? Are there some ways? Have you thought about trying this? And perhaps we could do it like this. And what about if we do this? These sorts of small nudges, and aha moments that sort of can really be quite transformational. So that's our approach. It's not the only approach. There are others too, and probably some firmer interventions that tell people what to do. But that's not us. That's not us at Homestart.
For me, as I listen to you talking about the work you do, and certainly from my experience of parents who have used the service in one form or another, it's the fact that somebody listens and having a safe space where you can be vulnerable and say, I'm struggling with this, or, I don't know what to do about that. Or I've got a parent or your child's grandparent who's telling me what to do, but it doesn't feel right. Have somebody who's prepared to just listen, um, and allow you to order your thoughts and perhaps to rehearse some different ways of dealing with it, I think is incredibly valuable. Not just for young, and everybody needs somebody to do that, don't they? Whether you're a new parent or not. But you layer upon layer upon layer when you have this tiny being that you're suddenly responsible for, or a toddler who's saying no 50 times more than they say yes a day, or you've got children just starting school and they're not thriving, or whatever. Having that confidence, somebody you can offload to, who isn't going to judge, I think it's just gold. It's really valuable.
Can I share a story
Please.
on that topic? One of the home starts I visited a few years ago, I met a mum in a play group, in a group setting, and I was the volunteer who had been working with that mum shared a bit of the backstory of the mum's journey to that day. So she had suffered all sorts of mental health challenges, including not wanting to leave the house for fear of bringing harm to her child, her newly born child. So she lived at the top of a big block of flats. She didn't have confidence getting in the lift in case the lift got stuck and she was stuck there with the baby. She didn't have confidence bringing the pram down the stairs because she thought she'd trip and harm the baby. She didn't want to take the baby outside because she was worried that all sorts of things could happen. Over the course of a few weeks, we got in touch with this mum. We built a relationship. Our volunteer built a relationship. A few phone calls, a few visits, built up a bit of trust, and began to sort of start working with that mum to sort of break this down a bit, not tell her that she needs to get out more, but actually say, well, what's going on here? How can we help? So over a slightly longer period, the volunteer began to take the mum out on small walks, and then eventually convinced her to get in the car to drive to this group setting. It happened once. They got there and she couldn't go in, so they drove home again and said, "Well, we'll try again next week." And they tried again next week. She drove. They were sitting in the car park, the volunteer, the baby, and the mum. and the mum had a panic attack. And the volunteer literally she told me she literally just sat there, let her breathe, concentrate on your breathing, take some time. And they just literally sat there together in this car. It can't have been more than a couple of minutes, but it's a couple of minutes that I can't imagine any other service being able to offer in that way, building that relationship in the first place, and then offering those few minutes in the car. We just don't really have those services around. There's not the capacity anywhere. So a volunteer offering their time is so powerful. By the end of this, the volunteer took the mum and the baby, they got out the car and they crossed the threshold into this play group. And the baby played on the mat with other babies and volunteers who were at the setting for the first time. It was the first time the baby had played with other children and loved it, really loved it. And the mum sat there and just actually, the volunteer got her a cup of tea. They sat down and they talked through, how is it? Just, look at the babies, really enjoying that, totally safe. And this was such a profound moment for the mum, for the baby, for the volunteer, for everybody else in that setting that day. And it was the start of changing this child's life. And it all boils down to time, listening, and just standing alongside people, which you can't, you really to see it in action is just so powerful.
And I think about this from an educator's point of view. If that child had stayed in the flat with no interaction with other children, just think how difficult the transition into school would be,
Mm.
how their capacity to interact with people, those capacities are created in those first few months and years of life. And if they don't have them, I'm not saying they won't develop them, but you start with a huge challenge, don't you? It's like hobbling somebody and expecting them to run a fast race. When you give them people that opportunity to experience something in a constructive and positive way, the outcomes are much bigger than the wonderful thing that happened, but the long-term impact of what was done would ripple down the years in terms of how that child interacts with the world.
Absolutely. But to put it a different way, if we said, what that mum needed, all she needed was 5 minutes of a person's time in a car. It doesn't quite sound the same, does it? And you say, well, maybe GPs should offer 5 minutes of their time to people in that situation, or maybe social workers should find 5 minutes to sit. And whichever way you try and bang it up in whatever process or whatever system or support is available, it doesn't quite have the same impact of relational, community-based work that's understanding people, building trust, building connection, and then walking with them at their pace. All our processes in the care system and every other system that we look at, the education system, the health system, they're about processing people and pushing them along these sorts
As
of
possible.
milestones.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's nobody with any time really. And then this is not a criticism of anybody because everyone wants to have more time, wants to be more relational, wants to be more compassionate. There's no teacher or social worker who doesn't believe in those concepts, but I just think it's not readily available in any of our systems.
And I think when you talk about 5 minutes in a car, if you imagine an iceberg, that 5 minutes in the car is the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? That it's all of the underpinning time and work that's gone on to create a relationship where, and I don't suppose it was a couple of minutes if it was a panic attack, you're probably talking more about 15 or 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, where that person has given that, created that safe space. And I think that we underestimate how important us having a safe space to be is. And if you've got somebody there who can hold that space for you, you are much more likely to thrive in that space than if you are trying to hold the space for yourself at a time of real stress and upset.
I do think that's the point. And if when Margaret Harrison it created the idea of Home Start and did feature volunteers at the center of it, she was clear that, it's volunteers. They don't have to be there. They're not being paid to be there. They're there because they want to be there. And I think that can come across so powerfully to people who might have a history of of not great interactions with services and not a lot of trust of people coming to say that they want to help. So it can make all the difference. And you asked earlier if, what sort of benefits do the volunteers get out of it. I go around thanking volunteers all the time. I think they're the most marvelous people, they're heroes. And I say thank you all the time. And they always say, oh, don't thank me, I'm getting so much out of this. They build their own confidence, their own understanding of different issues, their own compassion, their own sort of ability to to spot issues, to listen better, to, all these things. And for some volunteers, this turns into new routes for employment and new jobs that they might go after. For others, it's about connection with others in their own community. And they're absolute heroes, volunteers. They are the foundations of everything that we do at Homestart, but so much community-based work from citizens advice to the Scouts. These are institutions that are built on volunteer capacity, which is just wonderful in my opinion.
I couldn't agree with you more. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, what I'd like to talk about is the care system itself and what are the issues that you see on a regular basis and potential solutions to that. So don't go away. We'll be talking in just a minute. Welcome back. Peter, the care system in the UK, I think, is failing far too many children. If you look at the statistics, within 2 years of leaving care, over a third of those people leaving care are homeless. If you look at the prison population, it's disproportionately people who've been through the care system. And that's not to say that people who go through the care system are intrinsically bad at all, but they are often dealt with in a very different way. They've had lots of trauma, lots of moves, they find it difficult to trust, and so on. From your experience, and I know that Homestart deals with people not just who have been in the care system or who have experience of coming out of care or whatever, but you must have a view in terms of the common patterns that you see around the care system. And what are they, and what do you think might help to solve the problem?
Well, there's lots to say to that question. I guess I'd start my my starting point is that we use the term care system, and in my opinion, it isn't much of a system in that it doesn't have a sort of a reasonable start and finish and a series of um, things that connect together. I don't think it is a system. I think it's a collection of all sorts of bits and bobs, and I think it's the failure to conceptualize it as an overarching system from start to finish that has been part of the problem, which we might dive into a bit further. But maybe even more importantly than that, it's not centered on care. It's not centered on compassion. And it's not far too often, it's not centered on the best interests of children. And that's a bit, perhaps that's a bit provocative. I know so many people working in and around children with care experience who just do brilliant, wonderful work and they bust the gut to do everything for a child. But I think when we look at it overarching, when you talk about the outcomes that you've described, then it's not really prioritizing care. It's sometimes prioritizing, where spaces are in any part provision. Sometimes prioritizing, what geographically is available, what's affordable. It's sometimes taking assumptions about what the child is and what their background is and what would be in their best interests, which is sometimes not that helpful or certainly not that compassionate. So, my starting point is it really based on care? Is it really a system? And perhaps that's all a bit theoretical. So if I take that and dive in a bit further, um, you know, at through Homestart's work, we see our interaction with the care system is in different ways. Sometimes we're working with families who might be at risk of breaking down without some sort of support. Then obviously one risk of a family breaking down, relationships breaking down, is that the child might be more likely to enter the care system. At other times, one of the things going on in a family is that the child has particular needs that are quite difficult to meet at the best of times, but a family is also facing challenges such as poverty, unemployment, housing issues, it might struggle to meet those needs. They would probably struggle to meet those needs without those challenges, and those other challenges make it even harder. And other times there is unfortunately abuse and neglect, which are features of, unfortunately, features of our society, and they aren't always tackled. They're not always known about, and they're not always dealt with when they are known about. So, which is all sorts of systems interacting. It's not just the care system, it's the social work system, it's the education system and the health system, and everything else that where children interact with the system. So I bring all that together, and Home Start tries to play our part. Historically, traditionally, Home Start would not really work with children on a child protection plan or with any sort of specified need in relation to care, because I think it was felt in the early days of Home Start that that's someone else's work, that's social work's
Mhm.
territory, right? Or specialist charities. But so we might have been seen as an early intervention service to prevent some children from entering care, but really weren't always conceptualized as part of the care system. I think as we've matured and as the sort of understanding of childhood has developed over the years, I do think now that you can't separate what you think are early intervention services and what you think are later intervention services. I think it is all part of the mix of the jigsaw of support that could be available for families in all sorts of situations. So, I do think we now understand that better. And most recently, that became clear in some work we did with the John Lewis partnership, which I know they've taken such a brilliant and bold commitment to children with care experience. And they were working with Action for Children and Who Cares Scotland, of whom do direct work with children in care. And they brought us on board. We were partners with them already from a previous campaign, but they brought us on board because they recognise actually the early intervention we support, that we provide, offers a great deal of support for children at risk of entering the care system, but also parents themselves with care experience who might be more likely to struggle as parents themselves, as they become parents. So for all these reasons, I do think Home Start is intricately linked into the care system. Whether or not we sort of badge ourselves as a care charity, I'm not sure that's that important, but I think if I come back to those notions of compassion, of relational support, of being non-judgmental, of being there to stand alongside people in their journey, then I would say that all these values are so relevant for children with care experience, for whom I suspect many of them have not always experienced those values in their support.
One of my views, and it's very much my personal view, is that when children are taken into care, the um, the government, the country, society becomes a corporate parent. And often the treatment that young people in care receive, if a parent was doing that, they would be taken into care because it would be deemed as some level of emotional abuse, if nothing else, moving them from place to place. Some children experience as many as 10 different placements in a very short space of time, new relationships, new schools, that they then find it very difficult to trust and so on. And for me, I think that compassion, which is where we started this, a compassionate community, is it's very easy for us to be outraged when there's something in the news about a child that's been abused or worse, murdered. Um, and we're very outraged about it. And then it goes quiet until the next time. And I think, we know that there's a huge shortage, for example, of foster carers. And that number is growing exponentially, that we each have a role to play, and whether that's as a volunteer for an organisation such as yours, or opening our homes and our hearts to a child as a foster child, there are lots of ways we within society can help. But I think the other thing is putting pressure on those who are the policymakers to create, as you say, a system that's actually a system rather than this very, very fragmented position where we are now, where people work in silos. There's some brilliant work going on, but it tends to be in pockets rather than being systemic.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we have, I know in the sort of McAllister Review and some of the work going on in Scotland around the promise, there have been words used like love and friendship that have sort of gone out of favor, haven't they? Because when you're working with children, for all the absolutely brilliant advances in safeguarding and understanding of abuse and exploitation, somewhere along the line we've got nervous about using terms like love and friendship, and that's understandable in some regards, but I think we've lost a bit of humanity in the
Mhm.
way that we work with children. So, when it comes to children with care experience, it can be the case that they're seen as the others.
Yes.
They're that group over there, the care experience ones, and those other children over there, the normal children in inverted commas. I think that's just such a horrific way to think about children, and it's just so unhelpful on so many levels. If you think about a compassionate community around a child, everybody's got a role to play, whether it's a local authority in their corporate parenting role, if it's the school, if it's the friends, the friends' families, and everybody else. When I've worked with children with care experience, I've heard regularly stories of the trusted adult that really made the difference in their life. The trusted adult that was advocating for better outcomes with the local authority or when a placement ended. The trusted adult who was the only person remembering their birthday, or remembering what their needs and their preferences are in life. So I think, if I take that into this compassionate communities idea, I'd really love a world in which we didn't sort of label care experienced children as a group over there, nothing to do with us until it's our problem as a corporate parent. I wish we could get to a place where communities were built around children, that we could find safe spaces, we could find compassionate understanding of their experiences, we could deal early on with issues that seem to be problematic in their lives, and not leave it till the latest possible moment where more sort of dramatic intervention is required. So, I do think we're all part of the care system, in that we should all be part of the village around every child, really. But I know that might sound a bit twee on some levels, but it's how I see childhood, and it's how I see our role in sort of getting a better care system, is to concentrate on that care word rather than the system word.
I think that's absolutely true. We're going to go for another break now, but when we come back, I want really to think about the people who are listening to this program will be perhaps thinking, yeah, but what can I do? I haven't got a spare bedroom. I can't be a foster parent. Um, what can I do to make that difference? And I'd like us to explore that. Not that we've got necessarily a definitive answer, but there are ways, I think, where we can, as part of society, we can make a difference. Don't go away. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back. So, Peter, many people will think there's nothing I can do, and so they do nothing. What is it that you think that people can do to make a difference within society, to make it more caring, and in doing so, to help children and young people?
I think my starting point to that answer is that if you're listening to this, if you listen to any element of this series of interviews that you're doing, Gina, or anything to do with Fatima's campaign, or if you're even just curious about anything going on around children in the care system, then I think you're on the right starting point, because you're listening and you're trying to build your understanding of what care really means, whether you have experience of it yourself or not. I'm trying to understand the lived experiences of children who have come across a care experience in some form or other. So starting point is that you're on the right track. So thank you. I totally understand how it can feel powerless, because it feels such an overwhelming task to reform and transform the care system, that it can be, where on earth do you start? One of the things I'd say that you can do is you can add your voice to people who are campaigning for change. there are lots of charities who see parts of the care system that just don't work. I used to work at the Children's Society and led a campaign to ask councils to stop charging council tax to children who come from care, who have care experience, because we found that it was getting lots of young people into debt quite quickly. They didn't necessarily have the financial resources to cope, didn't have the financial experience always to understand that that's what was happening with council tax. So an easy thing that council could do is exempt care leavers from council tax. And we started a campaign. We got one council to do it. Then before long, we had 100 councils who signed up to this campaign. It's not particularly costly for the council, and it certainly would save them money in the long run, because they would need to deal with the issue of that child or that young person if they got into debt. So that you could add your voice to these campaigns. So the Children's Society, Action for Children, Become, these are charities who do brilliant, brilliant campaigns. So look out for them, sign up and add your voice. If you want to go further than that, get behind these charities further. You can give your time, your resources as volunteers, as donors, as supporters. You can run races for all of them, and that'd be wonderful. But to know that you're there, to know that you're an advocate for children and that you're part of the compassionate community, I think that would be my starting point to that answer.
And ultimately, people can become, through different organisations, a befriender. They can be part of organisations like Home Start. If you've got a few hours a week and you want to give something on a regular basis, there are opportunities to do that. But I also think that there are things like, we often walk past somebody who's homeless and it's as if they're a piece of rubbish, smiling. You may not be able to provide a resource for them, but you can actually see them as people, talk to them. Um, if you have a neighbour who's got a young child, befriending them and, saying, I'm going to the shops, do you need anything? Or come and have a cup of tea. I think there are the compassion within our communities. I think we've become very much front door closed. Let's stay within our own domain. And loneliness is one of the biggest problems. And that's true for young parents, but it's also true for the elderly. And so I'm broadening this out into, if you're talking about a compassionate community, there's lots that we can do as individuals that don't cost financially. So it's not about can you afford it? It's about is it on your radar? Are you thinking in that particular way?
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, and I totally agree with all of that. Probably understandably from my position, but I do think if we can help change the language
Yes.
around children with care experience, around we can help tackle the stigma of people who are suffering mental health challenges. We can help tackle the isolation of people who are feeling disconnected in different ways, whether it's the young or the elderly or anyone else in your area. And when we use the word community, our first thought, of course, is our geography and our doorstep. But there are other forms of communities. There are places that we all exist online. There are work communities. There are other spaces in which we exist and connect with people. So, all of these are communities which could be improved with more compassion, with more care, and I guess with more humanity at times, which when we look at the world around us, heaven knows we need more humanity. And so I don't think these are just theoretical, philosophical concepts. I actually think they're part of how we create change. And I would hope that people listening to this series of interviews are firmly behind this. But can we just start treating children as children and really preserve and protect their childhoods as best as we can, so they can grow up to be thriving adults? And that's something that we'd all want for our own children. We should want for every child in our country.
I think that's absolutely critical for us all. Where can people get hold of you if they're interested in finding out more about Home Start and the federations?
So you can certainly check out Homestart's website, homestart.org.uk. You can find out opportunities about your local Homestart. the beauty of having a federation is that there are 180 home starts around the country. So there might be one in your community. You can go and help out. You can be a volunteer. You could be a trustee. You could run a race. You could raise some money. So please do look out on our website. You can find your local home start. And more generally, if if you're interested in trying to sort of tackle systemic issues and some of the challenges facing the care system, it's not a bad starting point to think about your own locality and what's going on, and just ask a few more questions and try and find out a bit more. A quick example of that is in where I live. There was some work being done to create what looked like a sort of set of flats for students, but they weren't being designed or built with particular space in mind of cramming too many in. And when a bunch of residents looked at it, they realised that this was all being created for provision for children in and around the care system and with supported accommodation. And what turned out is that actually the specs for this house just weren't generous enough, and a couple of local residents resisted it, and it helped build a pushback on the council and improved the building of this accommodation unit. So it's a slightly random example, but there'll be something like that in your area that I'm sure you could lend your weight, your voice, your support to, just helping make a slight change, for the better for children who might be experiencing not living at home or living in supported accommodation or leaving the care system. So please just look out, be alert, and be sympathetic, and be a human would be my concluding remark.
Well, before your concluding remark, I just want to ask, I didn't ask this earlier and I should have done. If you want to be a Home Start volunteer, I'm assuming there is some training available. And what would that look like so you're not going in cold, you're not, and I'm assuming there are also safeguards for the families that you're visiting that people would need to go through.
Absolutely, yeah. So we have a training course. It's depending on what role you take, the training course is a bit different. If you're going to be a home visitor, it's a detailed training course usually over a series of a few weeks. One afternoon a week perhaps. Different home starts will run it slightly differently, but there's core content that you'll cover, including safeguarding, including what to do if you're worried about something, including what to do about your own well-being. Because these are tough roles. You do take on a burden, so what that all looks like. And so we definitely look after volunteers. You'll be well looked after. You'll meet other brilliant people doing the same thing. And for some people, home visiting is the right thing, but for others, it might be a commitment a bit beyond something that they're ready for just yet. So there are other options like group work support and other roles you might play to support that local charity. So look out on Home Start's website, or you could search your own local Home Start in your area, and please reach out to help. I know that every Home Start would love to have you.
And presumably those people are police checked to make sure that the right sort of people are coming in, so it's a two-way process.
All the right stuff is in place. And one of the, actually, I didn't really talk about this, but one of the critical parts in our work is the matching process between a volunteer and a family, because the same volunteer could get on brilliantly with one family and not so well with another family, just because of experience, personality, whatever it is, circumstance. And so it's a really powerful part of the process, which Home Start coordinators and Home Start managers are so good at, is knowing the fit. So I was speaking to someone the other day who they connected over gardening. Volunteer loved gardening, and his mum was struggling, but she really loved the open space. And they now do work together. They go out on an allotment. They're both looking after baby and looking after mum at the same time and building a relationship. So it's great stuff. So the matching process is part of that, making sure it's the right fit. Any problems with anything, then there's always someone to go to at the local Home Start.
Sounds brilliant. Now, we're about to finish the show, but before we do, we belong to an organisation called B1G1, Buy One, Give One, which makes giving, kindness, compassion part of your branding, if you like. And I invite each of my guests to choose one of four themes, and we will donate on your behalf. Those themes are clean water, education, health, reforestation. And we choose different projects. The projects are well vetted, and every penny, every cent goes to those projects. Which would you like to choose?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to say a quarter of all of them, but I'll go for health because I think, at the end of the day, good health, parental health, child health, and mental health as well as physical health is such a critical part of a thriving childhood on so many levels. So yeah, I'll go for health, although, the other three would have been equally important, I'm sure.
Brilliant, thank you. And remember, just by listening to the show, you are helping because we donate meals to the hungry based on the number of listeners. So get people to come and listen through Brushwood Media Network app or on the website, and you can find it in other places too. Now, I have a free spiritual blueprint, spiritual leadership blueprint, which is really an audit of where you are now and lots of advice and so on. You can have it for free. All you need to do is to email me at Gina Gardiner and Friends at gmail.com, and I'll send you a free copy. Put blueprint in the subject line, and it's not going to cost you anything. It's a really comprehensive personal development audit. And if you'd like one, then please email me. And the other thing is, if you're a great musician or you know a great musician who's not yet been discovered, they can be on my other show, which is Gina Gardiner Showcases Tomorrow's Talent. And if you'd like to be on that show, then fill the form in. You'll find that at Gina Gardiner, GinaGardiner, tomorrowstalent.com. Gina Gardiner, tomorrowstalent.com. And you could play four of your tracks and have an interview and get your music out there. So, love to hear from you. Just remains for me to say, Peter, thank you so much for joining me. And if you're interested in knowing more about the summit, you can either email me or you can go to the website fatimasukcampaign.com. Thanks very much. Take care now. Bye bye.